Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. What is in New York, a nice sunny day. And my name is Gianpaolo Baiocchi. I am director of the Urban Democracy Lab here at the Gallatin School at New York University. The Urban Democracy Lab has been around since 2014, and we always seek to promote critical engagements with future, more democratic, more just, and more sustainable urbanisms. We've worked with a variety of community partners. We promote public programming, scholarship, and curricular offerings and fellowships in this area. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're extremely pleased to host this event on new municipalism in the post-COVID world. Municipalism has been an interesting topic to us for the last few years. We've been lucky to partner with MINIM. I think it's been a couple of years, and MINIM is the main provider of today's programming. The convener of today's event is Vicente Rubio, who's a visiting scholar with us at the Urban Democracy Lab this year, along with Dima Abi Saab, who is a doctoral fellow at the UDL. Both of them have been working and helping foster this relationship between the Urban Democracy Lab and MINIM. One of the things we've been very interested in as a lab and as a community of engaged scholars has been the way that the pandemic has shown and exposed all kinds of precarities and inadequacies, particularly in our cities, but at the same time has provided a context for a new and renewed kind of activism around taking care of each other, around local solutions, while of course not foregoing the bigger picture. For us, this is the moment to talk about municipalism, and we're very happy to have today's panel. I'll pass it off with this to you, Vicente, who will introduce the rest of the speakers. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Gianpaolo, for the warm welcoming. Yeah, let me introduce a little bit, let me talk very briefly about the motivation for this panel, this conversation today, and also to briefly introduce the three speakers that we have today. Well, following what Gianpaolo was just saying, we could probably say that never as now has been so astoundingly clear how unjust, how unequal, and how cruelly inefficient our economic and political system is. Or maybe better said, never has been so generalized all over the world the view that there is something fundamentally wrong with the way capitalism works and how it has shaped our modes of life and our way of organizing our life in common. At the same time, it seems like amidst all our fears, lack of hope, this blinding revelation is not accompanied by a strong vision that might help us looking forward. It seems like we know what has failed, but we are unable to express alternatives. Or we indeed have and know of alternatives, but they seem to be unable to enter into the broader political discourse, saturated by desperation, by cynicism, by paranoia, sometimes by absurd cultural wars. To put it in a sort of selfish way, I organized this panel to see if others could help me to overcome this pessimistic perception, because I need it. But beyond myself, I'm afraid the current situation affects all of us in one way or another, and probably most of us share more or less this perception. So when Gianpaolo and Mehmet proposed the topic Cities, Crisis and Opportunities as the underlying theme for this series of discussion at Urban Democracy Lab for this semester, I thought it was probably a good idea to organize this kind of conversation that we are going to have. In a way, what I was thinking is, to open a space which will allow us to do a couple of things. First, helping us to process the shock of the myriad effects that COVID-19 has brought to our lives, to our jobs, to our way of doing politics, to our hopes and expectations about the future. And also, and to process all of it politically, not just individually, And the second thing maybe that I was hoping is, well, to provide an opportunity to think about the ongoing validity of municipalism as a political strategy. It's a political strategy that many of us here support. And well, but of course we probably need to rethink it in this new social, political, economic, and even cultural landscape. Regarding all these questions, well, I personally have more questions than certainties. But in any case, I'm convinced that our three speakers today will help us a lot to overcome these pessimistic perceptions. It is a pleasure and an honor to introduce my friends, my colleagues and comrades from MINIM, Federico Alagna, Lorena Zarate, and Laura Roth. Maybe I should, before I introduce them, I would like to share with you the web address of MINIM, because, well, just let me, here. So you can, I'm sharing there our website, it's municipalism.org, where you can see the kind of work that we've been developing until now. All speakers today, Federico, Lorena, and Laura, are part of MINIM. And just let me introduce a little bit their trajectories and experiences. Well, first, Federico Alagna will be the first in speaking. He's a researcher into European Union and Italian immigration policies. He's a PhD at the University of Bologna and Radboud University. He collaborates with many research centers, activist initiatives, and non-profit organizations. And he is a didactic assistant at the University of Bologna. Well, also another thing that I could mention about Federico is that he served as Deputy Mayor for Culture and Public Education of the city of Messina in Sicily. Then Laura will speak. Laura, she's a researcher and activist based in the Basque Country. She focuses on participatory democracy, political culture, feminism, and municipalism. And then Lorena Zarate is a founding member of the Global Platform for the Right to the City and part of its support team. She's the former president of the Habitat International Coalition and was also coordinator of the Habitat International Coalition Latin America office. And well, she has a very diverse academic training. She was born and raised in Argentina, but she has been living several years in Mexico City and now resides in Ottawa in Canada. While Federico and Laura and Lorena speak, I will share also some links of text that they have been written about the topic today, about COVID-19 and different activist experiences related to the COVID crisis, and also other work that we've been doing at MINIM. So then, Federico, whenever you want.
Thank you. Thank you, Vicente. Gracias. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks also to Gianpaolo, Mehmet, Dima, and all the ones who made this event possible. I'm very happy to be here, virtually with you, and to have the opportunity to share some thoughts, some reflections about these interesting and important issues that you, Vicente, were highlighting in your introduction. I would say that, I would start from one thing you were saying, Vicente, which is you have more questions than certainties. So do I, which is maybe not the best way to start a seminar, or perhaps it is, because eventually I think these occasions can be very important for all of us to share our thoughts, to share our doubts, and to share our questions. And perhaps we can come up with some answers. Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but at the end of the day, I think it's still very important to share this perspective, in particular, when we talk about issues like the one we are addressing here tonight, which is, yes, municipalism in the perspective of the pandemic. This is very, very important. I think that, of course, I mean, over the last 14, 15 months, we've been talking about the pandemic in many different ways. Of course, in many occasions, very terrible ways. I mean, we've seen terrible things happening all over the world. And we've also been discussing a lot about political aspects of the pandemic. And among these different issues, I think that the city dimension and municipalism in particular is for sure one of the most relevant aspects that we can consider from a political perspective when we talk about the pandemic. So what I tried to do, especially over the first phase of the pandemic, the first wave that, of course, especially in Europe and in Italy in March, April last year was particularly strong, was to try to read the pandemic through municipalist categories, and trying to do so based on a double understanding, which is on the one side based on my experience as political activist, which of course is very limited. I mean, it's very local, very rooted in my local experiences in Sicily. And on the other side, also trying to bring some understanding also from my work as migration researcher. So I tried with Minim, so with Laura, Lorena, and all the other people that are part of this great collective to share some reflections related to what the pandemic can tell us about municipalism, why municipalism can be significant from also trying to understand the pandemic. So I looked combining, let's say, strategies of and methods of an action-oriented research. I tried to look at what was happening, especially in Europe, not to be Eurocentric, but because that was like my perspective at that specific time, especially as I was saying March, April last year. I tried to look at what was happening in during the pandemic using municipalist categories and trying to focus on municipalist and local actions. And I think that what I saw back at the time and what I shared with other people, other comrades and fellow activists in Minim is something that can be still somehow relevant also now, and that's what I'd like to share with you very quickly tonight, just to give some inputs to the discussion that I hope will follow our interventions. So in particular, I tried to understand two main lines that were taking place during the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic, I don't think it did change much in terms of municipalism. Of course it did, but I haven't seen so far, at least, a structural change in municipalist practices. What I did see was the clear evidence. I mean, the way in which the pandemic made even more visible some trends, some tendencies that were already in place, and that had to do with the two main divides that I see in municipalist action. And I say so, I stress it again from a very action-oriented perspective, not from a scholarly one. On the one side, I think that the municipalism made it clear the big divide that exists between central institutions and local institutions, between the central level and the local level. This is something that I saw very, very clearly, and in a way, we also discussed it very much. We saw how we had, especially at the beginning, central governments, supranational institutions, international organizations such the WHO, trying to address the pandemic, and so working on a very high level of political debate and sometimes also political speculation. And on the other side, we had the local level, the level of the everyday life, when we had people who were basically trying to survive. That was what was happening. So there was this big clash that we saw between what was happening in the cities, in the towns, in the villages, in the rural areas, and what was the discussion taking place at national and international levels. This was a clash in most cases, especially in a European perspective. We saw it very, very much taking place in Italy, taking place in Spain, in England, in the UK. So this was a very clear trend that at the end of the day brings us back to one of the root arguments of municipalism. And the other divide was taking place between institutional actors and non-institutional actors. So we had institutions struggling to, like in most cases, in order to give an answer to people in need, but being incapable to do so in most circumstances. And on the other side, we had a lot of grassroots initiative, non-institutional actors, movements, collectives trying to provide these very answers and basically substituting themselves to the welfare authorities and other policy providers across the country. These two divides that in a way are in connection between one another and crossed each other along the way are key elements, in my opinion, to understand what is the municipalist challenge somehow, what is the municipalist issue in itself. And I think the pandemic perhaps made it stronger, for sure, from my perspective, made them more visible and more evident to everyone, and urged all of us as political activists to take action somehow and to understand these problems, to understand the limitations of a merely national or international, I mean, not locally rooted political debate and political action on the one side, and to understand the limits of institutions to provide meaningful answers on the other side. So this is essentially the main, these are the main issues that I could see, especially in this first part of the pandemic. And they opened up a lot of reflections on how this could actually strengthen the municipalist argument, how on the other side could weaken it. I think they opened up a lot of questions related to the sustainability of both systems. I mean, the municipalist system on the one side, but also the opposite. Let's say a system which ignores the needs and the specificities of local situations. On the other side, it also opened up a lot of other questions related to the sustainability in the long term of the good practices that we experienced in in many local situations, in many cities, towns, and villages across the world. So the point was, okay, we had like meaningful answers. Yes, there were like solidarity initiatives, there were political initiatives that were very important and sustainable, but to what extent were they able to challenge and to pose a challenge at the core of the system that was governing the politics of the pandemic at national and international level? And I think this question is more open than ever still today, and probably also depending very much on the specific national and regional contexts. We do have different answers to that. On the other side, and this is maybe one last input I would give to the discussion, I think that these double divides, so local, national, and institutional, non-institutional, also opened up a lot of questions related to the dark sides of the story, because we tend to speak, of course, from a municipalist perspective. We tend to speak of the local about the local level in very positive terms in most cases, because these are, I mean, we know that there are many interesting and successful, let me use this word that I don't like very much in this context, successful stories. But at the same time, I think that like from first-hand experience, I can say that we also saw a lot of experiences of local institutions and local movements going exactly on the other side, and like driving all the social and political forces towards an end that we don't like very much. I mean, trying to be let's say, trying to build up some sort of right-wing localism that did not provide any positive contribution to the solution of the crisis we've been living over the last year and a few months. So I think that to close my this first contribution, I think that the point which is relevant when we associate these two elements, the pandemic and the municipalist issue, is to understand how over the course of the months there have been a lot of different forces like pushing and pulling towards very different directions. At the end of the day, I think today we have a toolkit to understand, disentangle many of these issues. It's an opportunity somehow that in these terrible times, we also have to push forward some political debates. And of course, we would have preferred not to have this opportunity probably and to save many, many lives. Yes, but once we're here, I think we have this opportunity to have this debate and to understand how these arguments can be pushed forward and towards which directions. And to do so, we do have to address these problematic issues that came up, these challenges and best practices, yes, but above all, problems and challenges, because that is where I think we can learn the most. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Federico. Okay, let's continue with Laura.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Vicente, and everyone for organizing this. I'm happy I'm speaking after Federico because he's already presenting some of the main issues. Although now I'm not sure whether I can add a lot to that. I'll try at least to add some additional reflections about some of those points. I would like to start by saying that I agree with what he was saying about, but maybe reformulating it. So a situation like the crisis that the pandemic generated doesn't look like a very promising soil for municipalism to flourish. The immediate natural reaction that the situation required and seems to require still maybe was centralization, like clear coordination and clarity in terms of what had to be done quickly and in an organized way. And this doesn't sound very compatible with the messiness of local action by governments and movements enmeshed in horizontal decision making and things like that. So it doesn't. One could argue, and actually that was the feeling and the spirit or the conversations at the beginning of the pandemic. Like, what will happen with municipalism now that everything seems to be going up and to the center and up, right? And before I continue with the reflections, I wanted to make a really brief comment about what I'm talking about municipalism, and it's not simply about local autonomy or the autonomy of local governments as it is sometimes used in different environments. I'm thinking of what some people refer to as radical municipalism or new municipalism, which can be defined as local self-government, but by the people, not by the government, through radically democratic forms of collaboration between the local state and local communities. So that would be the central element of new municipalism, and it is based on ways of doing politics that move away from the traditional representative and state-centered democracy model, and aims to build political power from the bottom up by sharing it and working as a translocal network or federation of the local units. So it's both combining the the scale element, the democratic level, and the element, and also this articulation between communities and institutions in innovative ways. And now, and also before I continue, I wanted to say a few things about things that the crisis revealed, and I think we can agree that these two elements that I will mention were part of what some people were like, perhaps discovering through the crisis in many places. And the first one, and I might be like going out of the official. Well, I might know. I am going a bit out of the official description of the pandemic here. The first one is that the crisis showed, and especially the first part of the crisis, where lots of confinement measures were taken, showed that we depend on each other, that we are interconnected, and that the relationships that we have are key to our survival and our well-being. We need our friends, our family, our communities to feel safe and to share our lives. We need teachers in schools and nurseries who can take care of our children while we work and who can support the learning processes of children. We need people who can take of the elderly. We need public health workers from primary health to hospitals who can help us recover when we get sick. We need people who can produce, transport, and sell food. We need psychological support from professionals when we cannot deal with stuff on our own. We need artists to make our lives happier and to help us imagine different realities. We need cultural workers to help us imagine new worlds and understand the one we live in. We need people who can clean and fix our cities and towns. We need people who do research and help to develop medicines and vaccines, but also generate knowledge in other fundamental areas. We need journalists who can help us understand what's happening. We need people to drive buses and trains. We need public officials that make sure our democratic will is implemented and to coordinate many of the public tasks and activities. I was reading now. Sorry for that. So this is the first one. When the confinement measures were taken in many places, we suddenly realized that we needed other people to get on with our lives and for our well-being, and we depend on each other. So this is the first one. The second one, the second element that the pandemic made more obvious was that there are some people who are invisible to mainstream politics. I mean, we know this, of course, but the situation of people from other countries, like undocumented migrants, informal workers, like domestic workers, sex workers, seasonal workers in rural areas, children as well, people with mental conditions, long-term unemployed people, homeless people, all of these people suddenly became part of the public debate because no one knew what to do with them. Everyone was at home and like adapting to the new situation, and these people at the beginning were totally ignored in many places, and then suddenly became a problem that we had to take care of. Connecting these two elements, the fact that we are related and the fact that some people are invisible, I think that the crisis has shown also that our well-being depends on the well-being of those who are usually invisible for mainstream politics, and I think this is useful when we try to understand also, and I will go back to this in a minute, what is important when we are addressing a crisis, and what we can learn from this crisis for other situations as well. So coming back to to the general description of what has been happening, I've been running this study research in the UK, Spain, and Serbia about what happened in general in the political context and what was the municipalist response there. And there are three main conclusions that also Federico was sort of mentioning in a different way. The first one is that states have been centralizing power and issuing one-size-fits-all solutions to complex problems. And on occasions, they have militarized action and also discourses. The second one is that local governments in many places, of course, not in every place, but in many places have been dealing with the complexity of the actual social consequences of the crisis and of the confinement. And they have, on occasions, found creative solutions and collaborated with local communities in innovative ways. And the third one was that local communities have mobilized in order to support those who have been hit hardest by the crisis. So I don't think this changed anything. It actually reinforces. So in each of the three cases, the three kinds of actors were actually doing what they do best. So centralizing, coordinating, and supporting, respectively. So in each of these three countries that I was studying, of course, the political context is different. The municipalist movement is different in the three cases. But in spite of those differences, if you want, I can say more about each specific case later. But in the three cases, in spite of the differences, the trends have been very similar, and I think that's interesting, and it reinforces an intuition that we have in many places about what the consequences of the pandemic were, and about how these three kinds of actors were acting. So, what does it mean in terms of like municipalism more generally? I think. In order to evaluate whether municipalism has been useful or not in a context of a crisis such as this one, it's important to define what kind of crisis we're talking about. As I was mentioning at the beginning, states sound as the first like the best tool that we can use to address the crisis, but it's not that obvious for many reasons. I will mention just a few. The first one, for instance, this is a health crisis, and of course centralized action is needed and coordination, but the crisis also revealed how important primary health care is, for instance, and that's something that is dealt with locally. And also how important the collaboration with communities is in order to generate a better situation in terms of health. The crisis couldn't be addressed without the collaboration of the community and individual people, and it couldn't be addressed just by the use of force, just by forcing people to either stay at home or keep distances or whatever. So this is the first example. The second one, of course, this is an economic crisis as well. And then again, states seem to be the best tool. But states are, of course, victims of lobbies, and even if that's not the worst problem, the kind of approach that they can have toward economic problems is a one-size-fits-all solution, and legislation is general, and it has proved very inefficient in terms of addressing many of the economic consequences of the crisis, especially for the people who are invisible to the state and who can be more visible at the local level and for local institutions and local communities. And then the third crisis or dimension of the crisis is that this is also a crisis of care, connected to the two revelations that I was mentioning before. And to address these kinds of crises in terms of breaking our usual relationships and taking care of those who are invisible, centralized action is not very useful. So I do think that, of course, I share with Vicente and Federico that there's lots of questions and especially about the limits of municipalism. But I do think that municipalism has the potential of addressing the complexity of the crisis in ways that traditional representative democracies and governments are not. And this can be seen in many places. Because again, of the capacity to address the complexity, the scale of the action, and also the capacity of local governments, if they are willing to do it, to share power with local communities and also to collaborate with them. So I'm a bit past my time. I also have some thoughts about what's coming next for the movement in these three countries. I won't go into it, but I will just mention that the prospects are not very good in either of these three places. But still, I think we still need to wait a little bit to see what happens, and I do think that municipalism is a promising. So the fact that we can see this even in a situation of crisis like this one shows that there is an interesting potential there, and not only because of the efficacy or the ability to deal with difficult problems, but also because municipalism is addressing a key point that is at the core of many of the problems that we face in our societies, which is the way politics is organized and is done every day. And municipalism with this aim of sharing power and building new structures to share power, is able to generate a new type of political culture that can generate long-lasting change in society, and it can help fighting the far right and many other kinds of problems. But I will leave it here for now, so we can discuss it further in the debate. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Laura. Yeah, it was very encouraging talk. Okay, also, yeah, actually, of course, everything that related maybe to future challenges to municipalism is something that we can definitely discuss also during the Q&A. Speaking of Q&A, also I forgot to mention that for everyone here, for all the participants, you can use the Q&A feature, okay, to send your questions, and then I will moderate the questions and share it with the speakers. So now we have Lorena to close this first round of interventions. So Lorena, whenever you want.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Vicente, and thank you to the organizers and the Urban Democracy Lab for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to share also this panel with Federico and Laura. I mean, totally agree with the elements and the analysis they presented already. I will just try to maybe highlight some elements and eventually try to add few more things to the table in case they might help to this reflection. Of course, we all agree that the pandemic and the nature of the interlink crisis that it brings forward. They show us, of course, the priorities and the urgencies and the things that are wrong, as Vicente was putting it at the beginning, but also possibilities to do things differently, to change both the narratives and the practices, I would say. And of course, linked to the, as Laura was mentioning, the putting a very strong light on the vulnerability and the interconnections and the interdependency that we all share. And I would add to that, not just between humans, but also with non-humans or nature, more broadly speaking. And I think that should take us to deepen some of the reflections and the alternatives we want to work on. Of course, we need to rethink. It's clear, even more than before, that we need to rethink the places we live in and the territories that we live in. And again, from this broader eco-social perspective, if you want. Rethink the economy, or the economy, different economies, as way to provide for life and to allow for social reproduction and economies for life and not for profit and accumulation. And of course, we need to rethink also the decision-making processes linked to all that. And I would say, like, a little bit reframing or rephrasing what the previous speakers were already mentioning. But for me, I think there are two key components into these rethinking and what the pandemic has shown. And one, of course, is care. And Laura already talked about that in all the different dimensions and the centrality of care. And the other one linked to that, of course, is the commons. Of, if you want the link to that, the need to rethink the public sphere, and that both at the economic and the political level. So care and commons are strongly linked, of course. They cannot be care without commons. And I would say, and commons, of course, for social reproduction and for life and for well-being. And commons, vice versa, should be based on an ethics of care, and not, of course, for privatization or private accumulation. So I think at the heart of this all, the pandemic has also shown the need of decommodification of life, and we know that this is contrary to the previous trend, and in particular under the neoliberal era. And if our societies are more fragile today, or were more fragile in face of the pandemic, was exactly because of 3 or more decades of brutal criminal neoliberal policies, privatizing everything, but also reducing the public sphere, and reducing the abilities of the state to operate, downloading responsibilities to the local governments and local communities, but without the resources, and so on and so forth. And so we know that the complex situation that we were in before the pandemic hit. And of course, the situation was very worse by that. But we also know that all these should be crossed by a transversal kind of scalar approach, or territorial or spatial approach, if you want. And that to both, to care and to commons. And of course, the feminist approach to this will say that we need to see scale, the most multi-scalar lens to this. So that will start from our bodies and the different bodies and different situations, passing through, of course, neighborhoods and communities, and again, different neighborhoods and different communities, and how they were differently hit by the pandemic and affected, and will be in the years to come. But then going beyond that, of course, and the scale of the territories and the scales that go beyond the city limits. And I think this is crucial for both the new municipalism and the right to the city approach, that while we are talking about recreating and strengthening a local or a grounded political community, we are not talking just in terms of the administrative boundaries, and as we are not just talking about winning elections or changing the party in government. So this territorial approach that is crucial for facing the crisis, but also trying to move forward and creating different ways to organize our societies. And of course, in that, issues of proximity, but also issues of the relationship between the city and the countryside, issues of food production, issues of water, and so on and so forth. And of course, the next layer will be the translocal and the global cooperation. We also know that it's not possible to address the health emergency or the economic crisis, not to mention the climate change crisis, without this global scale and translocal cooperation and common narratives and practices around that. So I think the issue of scale is crucial for these movements and how we understand both the problems and the situations we are facing, but also the different ways to address changes and to make to move forward. So the two crucial issues linked to care and commons, again, the decommodification of life, and the second one, we might call the reconstitution of the public sphere and the public responsibility, and of course understanding that beyond the state institutions, as a political community able to organize and mobilize and address issues beyond the governments. And in this sense, the reflections by both Federico and Laura are very pertinent, and in the sense that, and we also see these, and we have been having discussions not just with civil society organizations, but also with some local governments from different regions, this trend to centralization, a very, very problematic trend that usually comes with growing authoritarianism or less democratic forms of decision making, and open militarization in many cases, even in highly democratic countries. And we see, for example, the logistics of the vaccination and all that actually in the hands of the military. So highly problematic. And of course, the privatization of healthcare and the production of the vaccines in many places, and the centralization also of the distribution and so on. So highly unequal. And I think we need to reflect a bit deeply on this, because when we talk about the possibilities of changing narratives and changing scenarios, together with this centralization, I will say most countries, we see a narrative of linked to actually to a discourse of war. So the crisis frame as a war against the virus, and an invisible enemy, then the front lines, etc. And I think we know what more or less where that is coming from, but I think it's very problematic as a very powerful tool, a symbolic tool, but also allows for a very narrow and problematic framing, a very, again, vertical and authoritarian way of decision making, justified because of the urgency and the need to make quick decisions that affect millions of people in just within hours, on a few days, and how to organize that in the territory as well. So and the military approach is very powerful and has a long-standing tradition and in theory and knowledge to do that. So this is very problematic, because then of course we get into lockdowns, we get into curfews, we get into all these courses that I think they're problematic for all, but particular for some of us that grew up under dictatorships in some countries. And of course, we don't believe that anything good can come out of that. So, and I would add to that is also very masculine and very a way of doing politics that is not the way that we want to see moving forward. It's not certainly the way that either new municipalism or the right to the city I'm putting forward as a more collaborative, horizontal way of decision making, addressing again this interdependency and vulnerabilities. So I think we need to be very careful about that too, and the role of the discourse and the symbolic elements and signs justifying some kind of approaches. So again, the right to the city and the new municipalist agendas actually address that and bring forward different ways of understanding all those topics, all those elements, and bring forward some key components, again, that are linked to a vision based on human rights and the responsibilities of the different spheres of government in terms of that, and going beyond, again, political and party agendas and electoral timings. Co-management and co-production of policies and initiatives for our territories, so that not everything is in the hands of the government, should not be, and of course that link to the commons again, and to constitution of the public sphere. And we have seen this moving along in different places, and in particular a strong mobilization by communities, even under very, very difficult circumstances in many places, and how the first wave of many of the policies that governments were putting forward didn't take into consideration all the different needs of different communities, both in terms of the sectors of the population, but also in terms of the different neighborhoods and the segregation, the spatial segregation of different communities. And in this sense, some of the interesting, or we have been doing some mapping about some of those initiatives. And of course, the most successful ones are the ones where the local communities, the local organizations are collaborating or have the support from local governments, allowing those things to happen and supporting those things. And of course, proposals to take the social function of land and property very seriously. We know that these stay-at-home policies bring forward, of course, the housing crisis all over the place, not just in the global south, but also in the global north, and homelessness and precarious housing conditions and so on. So the need to be very creative about that, and not just moratoriums and moratoriums and support for people to stay at home, but evictions, stop evictions and all that, but also to think about what will happen, what should happen with all the places that were already empty, and now even more so because of the crisis, and to rethink, repurpose many of the places and spaces we do have in our cities. So several initiatives they're moving forward, and we know that this is changing at least the discourse and is creating some momentum among some local communities in different places, and again collaborating with some municipalist movements and networks. We have been seeing that shift even from before, but even more so after the pandemic hit. So the centrality of the care and the centrality of the commons is coming forward, and of course this will not be a change of an immediate change, and it will not be certainly an easy change, but I think we're moving in those tensions once again, the tension towards privatization or individual solutions, towards community-based solutions and collective solutions and collaborations at different scales. So I think we need to keep moving in that direction, and it's not something that will be solved easily or once and forever. And for us, it's important to have this agenda and that's this shared agenda between the new municipalist and the right to the city movements, because I think that those elements are crucial to move forward, in particular in this context. I will leave it there because I think I already passed my time. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Lorena. Thanks a lot. Yeah, okay. So I think maybe, well, again, for all attendees, you can use the Q&A feature here in Zoom. But I think maybe just to start, maybe we can, while people are thinking about their questions, etc., maybe I would like to I don't know, throw maybe a sort of a comment or maybe some questions following basically also what Laura, I think, already started to say, also Federico, and also now Lorena, maybe focusing more on the sort of like looking to the future, right? Like the kind of challenges that municipalism might face, and how municipalism can, municipalist perspective and also political strategy can help us to confront the current situation. And I wanted to know, I think Lorena already mentioned some of them, like, for example, the commodification of life and the reconstitution of the public sphere. But also, I was wondering maybe, what do you think, or all of you think, could be like emerging issues or problems that might constitute maybe the future or upcoming spaces of struggle. Of course, I mean, situations vary a lot all over the world, but I'm just thinking just as examples. But for example, and of course, I'm shaped by my experience living here in New York, but also coming from Spain. So basically, those are the two contexts that I know better. But I'm thinking that, for example, I guess housing, and probably Gianpaolo can say something about this and others here, but housing seems to be also becoming a really crucial problem right now. I've been also noticing that, for example, and healthcare in general, but I think, for example, all issues related a space that maybe can be politicized in some way, not just like treated as a sort of medical question, but actually a political question. And also another issue I've been thinking lately also is the role of maybe, because to put it in sort of philosophical terms, those are the people that well are most affected by this perspective for the future. I don't know. I think, yeah, my video is freezing. I hope you can hear me. But well, yeah. So these are sort of my questions. So what do you think, Lorena or Federico and Laura? What kind of topics or issues you identify as emerging issues for struggle in the coming future? Okay, I'm gonna use the chat, okay, to my questions. But in the meantime, also, if others have other questions.
Sorry, while you raise the question again, just to be clear, do you mean challenges, like in general, because of the COVID crisis, or especially for municipalism and the municipalist movement as such, as a movement that is able to grow and in this specific context.
Maybe I think I was thinking more in general, in the sense of how there are like several issues that are becoming more and more urgent, even more than before, I mean, or specifically in this context, and then how maybe a municipalist perspective on those issues, what can contribute that municipalist perspective to understand those issues in a more interconnected way, or in a more creative way?
I guess the first one that comes to my mind, and it's connected to both, so both with the specific situation of the pandemic and also like a more general problem of politics and for municipalism, is connected to what Lorena was mentioning before, like the role and the changes in the political discourses and the political culture. How, I mean, this is a feature of politics in the sense of representative formal politics, this masculinized way of understanding power and of understanding conflict and leadership and many other issues, and this to me is not only connected to how the crisis is being managed, but also to the rise of the extreme right in many places, and I feel one of the greatest challenges that many of our democracies are facing right now is that they are not able to address those issues with the traditional tools of the traditional political parties, of the whole political spectrum except the political right. I mean, from to the center to the left, to the center right, where politics is done in a very hierarchical way, based on confrontational ways of doing, and so on. And statistics everywhere show that people are disenchanted with that way of doing politics, and extreme right is gaining support precisely because it is questioning those traditional institutions and those traditional, like, technocratical, boring, hierarchical, disconnected ways of doing politics. And I think the pandemic is showing how in situations of crisis those characteristics are reinforced, like the government of experts, hierarchical decision making, even militarized decision making, and militarized discourses, confrontational discourses. Like, there's always a war with someone. If it's not pandemic, it is something else, either I don't know, another kind of economic problem, or another political adversary, or anything. And I think that anything that contributes to that is problematic. And I think that the interesting feature of municipalism is that I'm not saying it's the only tool for that. Of course, there's many social movements arguing for a change in the way politics is done. But the interesting thing of municipalism is that it connects the community part with the institutional part of politics in a place where this is possible, which is the local scale. And it offers a way of dealing with that problem. I cannot say that this is the root of every other problem, because that would be too much. But I do think that it is a very central problem, like the political culture and how problems are understood and described and processed in politics, because this applies to many other dimensions, like economics, environmental issues or health issues and many other dimensions. So in that sense, yeah, I feel that municipalism has a potential there, but unfortunately, these are also problems for municipalism. I mean, it's not easy for any kind of organization or collective or political party, whatever type of organization, to deal with these issues, because they are also part of those practices to a certain extent, and we don't really know how to do politics in another way. We need to imagine that while this is happening and this is explored in different places. So I think it's really challenging, but it's really promising. And I personally cannot think of any other alternative but to really focus on that as a way of changing things. Just changing people in politics doesn't seem to be enough. I mean, that just changing the faces and just having the candidates that are not extremist or I don't know, authoritarian doesn't seem to be enough in order to change that very rooted problem. So I think that what's interesting about municipalism is that it can explore and implement these other ways of building power and sharing power that is more compatible with care in life as we understand, like ordinary people understand it, and not simply professional politicians.
Federico, do you want to add something, or?
Yeah, sure. Of course, well, first of all, I definitely share what Laura was saying. I agree, and I also share this perspective. I'm not the same in what space structure, but I can do is saying that giving a couple of more ideas that can be helpful from my perspective. And I would say, can you now? Because I think I had some comments. Work.
Yeah, I think it's going. Yeah, with some cuts. Yeah, maybe if you want to try without video.
Yes, if you prefer, or try. I don't know. I'll try to give me better. Maybe I don't know this way, and if we got problems, you just text me. Yeah, I was just saying, I think like two more struggle that I can think. Something that we've seen also in the past, but I think now a very, very important one would be the social and sanitary issues. Very, very crucial. Cities, in most cases, especially, I can. Apparently, we still have. Oh, sorry about that. I can try to fix a bit the connection, even though it's if Lorena wants to go now, and I will try to find a way. Let's see.
Okay, maybe while Fede is working on the connection. Maybe I just wanted to ask maybe something about what Laura was saying. Also, is that it's just an idea, but it's just that it's kind of paradoxical about this situation. The fact that I don't know, like there is so evident, as you all have pointed out, like the centrality of care, the dependency of others, and how this contrast, this huge contrast about what the COVID has the sort of these lessons of the COVID crisis, and at the same time, this like really strong sense of, I guess that there is like a strong need for belonging and connection with others. And apparently in the public discourse, this need for belonging is basically formulated only in right-wing terms, right? Or in very like fascistic terms. And I don't know, and that there's like a strong paradox there that is really frustrating, I think, for many of us, because exactly as you all pointed out, it's like the centrality of care is and it's like, I don't know, it's really frustrating to try to think about outcomes or ways out of this situation. And at the same time, like the answers are right there because are very material and very evident in many ways. And at the same time, it's really difficult to express that into a discourse that's capable to break with all this noise, mediatic noise going around with all these false polarizations that the right wing always like to do, and very like strong identitarian discourse of many kinds that are now probably an expression of the uncertainty and the need for a sense of belonging by many people, but only formulated in like very identitarian and abstract terms in many ways. But I don't know, just to add that, because while listening to you, Laura, I was just thinking about that. But maybe, I don't know if Federico.
I can try again if it works or not, because my connection says it's great. I hope so. I was saying that maybe two spaces we see right now are aspects. It's not great. Oh. So I don't know. How can I try? Because connection says it's good. So well, I leave it to for now. I will try to fix my connection. I'm very about. Let's put
Okay, maybe while Federico prepares the connection. Yeah, we have a question by Cynthia Freitas. I will read it, okay. The new municipal strategy seems to be aimed at developing more radical forms of democracy based on liberal democracies as a starting point. What about places where there are already authoritarian trends or authoritarian governments in place? Is this a challenge for thinking new municipalism in the global scale? Yeah, that's a good question.
I don't know, Lorena, do you want to? Okay. I think it's not necessarily a strategy only in liberal democracies. Actually, one of the most interesting examples of municipalism and most developed ones is the case of Kurdistan. Not only in a context of an authoritarian, more than one authoritarian government, but also in a context of war. Of course, it's quite different from municipalist strategies in other places, because they have built in some places they have built structures, political structures that are totally disconnected from official state and local institutions. But I think it's definitely an interesting strategy in authoritarian contexts, and closer to us, actually. Well, not to you, Cynthia, because you're in Brazil, but in in the case of Serbia that I was mentioning before, for instance, the country has been cataloged, classified as a not fully democratic last year because of the highly authoritarian government they have, and there you can see how interesting the case of the municipalist movement in Belgrade is. For instance, they have been gaining a lot of visibility, and of course they have been struggling, because in that context, specifically because of how the media is controlled by the central government, and especially by the president figure, and there's no space for political opposition, actually, none. I mean, it's not about municipalism. Like there are no political parties with ability to go into the parliament, and also they have boycotted the last presidential elections for that reason. But even in spite of that, the municipalist movement in Serbia has been getting into the political agenda, mobilizing enormous numbers of people for specific causes in the city, and we'll see what happens in the future. The problem in that specific case is I guess it's a problem more connected to the fact that it's a capital of the country. Is that the temptation to become a national level organization is too big. So in order to have more strength, there's that. But that's something that is always a danger with political municipalist political organizations. Try to become to have more impact by scaling up quickly or too quickly, instead of building networks with organizations in other places. But certainly, I mean, I would say I think it's a strategy that can work in many places. I think it depends. The success of the strategy depends more on how, to what extent there is already an engaged civil society, or part of civil society that can be active and help spreading the municipalist movement, than to the fact that there's a liberal democracy or an authoritarian or more authoritarian government. That said, of course, the strategies might be different in a liberal democracy than in an authoritarian one. The more authoritarian you get, the more interesting it might become, building structures outside official institutions, and the more liberal, the easier it can get to go into those institutions and to try to change them, because the danger is not there, of, I don't know, like in the case of Serbia, of I don't know, wiretapping, like being chased by the police, or going to prison, or receiving like direct attacks in public events and things like that. But yeah, I think the strategies might vary, but I wouldn't say municipalism is not a good idea or anything like that.
Maybe, yeah, Lorena or Federico. Federico, I think, is back. Yeah, if you want to add something or continue along the lines of what Laura was saying.
Federico, you want to try again?
No, you, Lorena. That's all right. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can address the question directly. I'm far from being an expert on this, but I would say that any democratizing movement in any place will need to be strongly rooted in the local, and as Laura was mentioning, of course, like a local strong civil society, etc. And in many cases that starts with very little groups and groupings and neighborhoods and so on, usually around very concrete issues, and then linked to broader democratic or the broader need for democratization in the countries. I can mention the examples in the 60s and the 70s in Latin America, for example, in many cases against open dictatorships, formal dictatorships with military regimes. In other cases, more like these guys, like hidden proto-military, proto-democracies, or whatever. I mean, people in theory still voting, but very, very authoritarian regimes and undemocratic regimes. And in those cases, the organizing at the local level was key, and in many places, starting even at the neighborhood level. And in the context of Latin America, the so-called informal settlements or self-built neighborhoods were key for this. So people organizing to actually have the right to be in the city and access better housing and better services and sanitation and so on, that eventually from there organizing to ask for more democratic means and participation. From the local level up to the national level. So just to say that it's very difficult in the case of Latin America, will be very difficult, and I'm generalizing here, but will be very difficult to explain the democratization process in the 90s and on without very localized organizing and struggles that in many cases took municipalist forms and claiming from participation in local politics and local governments. So not sure that helps, but it's the part of the story I know more.
Federico, if you want to add something.
Yes, thanks. I will try. Let's see if it works now. And to be honest, I'm not an expert on the topic. And by the way, since I was out and back in, perhaps I missed something. So maybe I will repeat something that Lorena already said. So sorry about that. I think it is actually a challenge to a certain extent, but being a challenge doesn't mean it doesn't work. I think it is a challenge to the extent in which it requires an effort to a certain extent to probably not adapt the concept of municipalism, but because I think it's very slippery concept, also this idea of adaptation, but it's rather to understand what form of municipalism can be developed in a specific country. So of course, I will say that depending on the institutional and political context that you have, not only in a country, but in a whole region, be it Europe, North America, South America, whatever, you develop different forms of, well, not only of municipalism, but of any other political approach. So also in the municipalist case, this happens. So of course, it is something that challenges us to think in a different way and to develop different strategies. In a very brief and perhaps like very common sense way, I would say it makes things more difficult, probably, yes. On the other side, I also think, again, from a very external perspective, that probably municipalism can be exactly an interesting and game changer to a certain extent, specifically in contexts where we have authoritarian governments in place, or where liberal democracies are not well established. I think that challenges posed from local communities to the established centralized autocratic governments can perhaps take different forms, different shapes, and be more effective if conducted in a way which adheres to municipalist principles and which combines probably also this idea of like connecting the two sides of institutional life, so inside institutions, outside institutions, etc., etc., etc. So I know this is very general because, yes, it's not really made, but I think that this is actually something that could be very interesting. And I'm sure there is much that has been said and that will be said about this across the globe.
Can I add something to this? So what Federico was mentioning made me think that actually on some occasions the fact that not that there is a liberal democracy in place, but if you go a bit more specific, and there is a friendly government in terms of like having a state government that is progressive, that is that has a discourse that is similar to the discourse around specific topics that the municipalist organizations have, and so on, might actually be worse in terms of developing a municipalist strategy. I mean, I'm not arguing for like the worst is so the worsening of the situation is better for the revolution or anything like that. But actually, in practice, the fact that there is a friendly government might generate certain incentives that might disarticulate municipalism. I think the case of Spain is really interesting in that regard. The development of the municipalist movement in recent years, the last wave of municipalism, developed in parallel to Podemos, the national political party, and this generated lots of tensions, and of course they reinforced each other for some time after 2015, but then it generated lots of tensions. And actually, when Podemos, which was the main ally of municipalist platforms at the national level, when they went into government, that became made things more difficult, not only for those municipalist platforms that were already out of government because they lost strength in the last few years, but even for cases like Barcelona, where the government was still under a municipalist platform, such as Barcelona en Comú. In the last 2 years, especially the last year, there was some kind of merging between Barcelona en Comú and Catalunya en Comú, which is the Catalan level political party, and Podemos at a state level. And there is this trend of like scaling up really quickly because there's a friendly government and you want to strengthen both, and then municipalism is actually losing its potential at the local level as a tool of transforming not only what is done, not only the policies, but also the way politics is done. And I think it's really tricky. I mean, thinking about the environment in which municipalism can flourish is really tricky. It's quite often it's a matter of like really difficult balances between different elements, like the role of civil society and the kinds of political parties there are, and the kind of political system there is, and things like that. So I would I don't know, I think it's even more complex, and the strategies are might need to vary from place to place and from time to time, even in the same place when the circumstances change. So I don't know. I think it's a really difficult question when you put it more broadly.
We haven't received more questions. I don't know if you would like maybe to continue a little bit more, or I don't know, or maybe we can just stop here. How do you feel? Yeah, I don't know if let's see. Yeah, right now there are no more questions. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe just to conclude a little bit, if just following this last point by Laura, I was just thinking a very naive question, right? It's like, well, how do we do things, right? How do we, what we've been discussing, right? What kind of strategies we can put in motion? I mean, I'm aware it's this kind of very naive questions with very complex answers, okay, right? But again, as I was saying previously, for example, something that I'm really worried about is like this feeling of impotence of how to transmit certain messages and certainties that I think municipalists can provide for certain answers to the situation. But then, yeah, how difficult is that to permeate broader society in a way, because the political climate doesn't, it's really difficult, right? I don't know, it's like, I'm thinking, of course, like just following what Laura was saying, but of course, how to use a sort of war expression, but how to rearm political society in a way, or how to nurture civil society again, to take more initiative, or how to, for example, how to dilute like certain discourses of the far right and certain identitarian trends, how to maybe build a whole other discourse that can permeate society and can help people to see other ways of framing the current situation, and how to engage politically in a different way vis-a-vis the current situation. I mean, I don't know, I guess it's too broad, but I just like keep thinking about this and this again and again, but I don't know if you have any comments or.
I actually would have a quick comment if my connection still goes well. It's short, and probably your question is not naive, it's nonsense. I think my comment is very naive, but okay, my connection is stable apparently again. No, I'll try. I think we referring to the situation of municipalism in Italy, especially because this is what I know the most. I think that for a long time, been thinking of municipalism in the way. And it was the same strategy that was successful in different places of Italy for some time. For some elections, it was good, and were some interesting experiences. This phase is over. I think we need to understand that. I mean, right now we have to face the fact that municipalist phase is over, and this doesn't mean that municipal is over. The point is that we need to think to readapt it. But this point, which is that it's naive, but it's important to do that. It's just acknowledge that this is over. We need to start a new one. Starting a new phase means to really discuss every single piece of our puzzle, to understand that everything can be changed. Of course, not our principle, of course, not commitments that stands as it, but strategies need to be discussed again. That's something that's hard to do. I think I mean, this is the big contradiction. Very well grounded in social sciences now, how we to promote change in the society, but resist a bit to change ourselves in our comments. So thanks for that. I'll stop here also because apparently I have these problems, these question problems, and sorry for that.
Thanks, Fede. Yeah, the sound was a little bit, but I think it was really important what you were saying. Lorena, Laura, you want to add anything?
Yeah, maybe I'll go quickly. That's a very difficult question, and I think yeah, it's part of the questions that we are asking ourselves, and what is possible, what is needed, etc. in this very challenging context. But I will try to focus just on two things or two strategies, maybe. One, from the point of view of civil society and understanding municipalism as part of a broader strategy to transform society, and not, again, just not to be in power or to be the local government and so on. In that sense, I think both for municipalism and for the right to the city, one of the key calls right now is actually to widen our networks and alliances and establish broader dialogues with other groups, because as Laura was mentioning, we know there are several people, communities, institutions, and so on, very aware of the need to produce radical changes in our societies, and it's not just that, but I think that now the discourses are aligning more and more, and because of the urgencies and priorities that this COVID crisis has put forward. So I think there is a momentum there, and there is kind of a natural, if you want, coming together and tuning of the different discourses and practices. But I think we need to make that explicit, and we need to seek for those spaces of dialogue and coming together in a more active way, I will say. So and building stronger alliances and so on. And on the other hand, at the more institutional level, if you want, I do think that we need to have like a common agenda for that, of course, a broader redistribution of power and resources, but in terms of devolving that to the local level. We know the national states are quite new in history. I mean, they have 200, 300 years, so on, so forth. But before that, there were local communities, and there were local political communities and local power. And I think we need to kind of claim that, the devolving of power to the more territorial level. But that should be part of a global agenda. And even under so-called liberal democracies, if you compare in different countries under similar regimes, the role of the municipalities and the power they have is very, very different. And in some cases, they will access, 20% or more of the national budget and money. In other places would be less than 5% or so on. So even in those terms, I think we need like a global common agenda on fighting for that redistribution. I mean, at the macro scale, if you want, the redistribution of resources and power to the local. And I call that a revolution, really, to the local level. And again, understanding that the local will not just be the government that won the elections, but the local will be the community in the broad sense. So for me, those are kind of two main strategies that should we pursue more collectively in moving forward.
I agree with what Lorena was suggesting. I think I agree with Federico, but although I don't know if I got everything, but he was, if he was referring to like reflecting and learning from the past experiences in Italy and learning from that. I guess that's I mean, I think it's an interesting moment because of how municipalism has been quickly evolving in many places to think about what's working and what's not working and why, and to reflect about that, not only locally but also to exchange between different experiences in different places. So I think like a very immediate thing that can be done is to learn from that, and not only from, as I was saying, not only from successful cases but also from the failures. So that's one thing. And then in terms of more concrete strategies, I will mention three things. The first is actually, so the first two are actually, they can go together, or they refer to the same stage, and it is, and they are first to organize, and Lorena was mentioning this at some point before in her not now but in a previous intervention, focusing on concrete issues at the local level as a way of mobilizing people, and I think that's not only very efficient but also it's a great antidote against the far right and this ability to mobilize people around enemies that are not real and things that don't really threaten us. So that allows people to channel their dissatisfaction and their energy towards concrete things. So that's one part of the strategy. Another one, so the other part would be more in this is more now connected to the electoral dimension of municipalism, but also as a way of rethinking politics. I think it's really interesting, the strategy that has been followed in France in the last elections of opening the political project to the views of everyone involved, and engaging people in shaping what has to be done at the local level and what the project is in relation to the local institution, engaging local movements in shaping the political manifesto, or even a manifesto not for the elections but as a coordinated platform at the local level, whatever, but in relation to local institutions. I think that's really powerful, and I think in the case of the Spanish cities, this sort of happened that in the first round of the municipalist elections. Most of these platforms started by writing ethical codes and participatory manifestos and things like that, and that was a way of mobilizing people with and that had a great impact, because it is challenging the key problem with politics, traditional politics, and this dissatisfaction that people have with traditional democracies, and it allows them to think of different ways of imagining these institutions and these politicians as well, and how what they should do, how they should act, who are they responding to, and things like that. So that's the second thing. And then the third one, I think it's really important. I mean, not that it's a good strategy, but if that is not done, it's really difficult to achieve this municipalist goal of articulating, coordinating what's happening in the community with local institutions. And this is thinking of strategies to reform and dismantle traditional ways of structuring state institutions at the local level. I don't think that the municipalist movement has a clear agenda on that specific dimension yet. The agenda seems to be usually either to organize at the local level or to organize and then run for elections, maybe to do concrete things like implement concrete policies, but not to rethink those institutions and to change the machine. I think if that doesn't happen, it's really difficult for such a project to really address the key problems. So this is really difficult. I mean, how to do this? Like, how would public institutions look like in terms of the commons, in terms of participatory structures, in terms of sharing power? How they would look like, we don't really know. We need to think about that, and also how to get there. So even if we have a plan, like how to implement that plan, because it's not easy, like to change legislation. It's not easy to mobilize people for that. It's not easy to get people interested in those issues either. So I think that's really problematic, but it's really important at the same time.
Thanks a lot, Laura. I believe we have now, there are a few questions or comments by Tom Osher in the Q&A. I'm not sure if we have the time now to address all of them now, but basically what Tom is saying, maybe if you can access the Q&A, well, he's sharing a 7-minute animation explaining horizontal governing. And then basically, his question is, Laura, what about people volunteering to administer and manage particular sectors, assemblies of experienced workers and experts for each sector, and a larger circle that is made up of 2 people, perhaps a man and a woman, for the purpose of collaborating and agreeing on proposals from the individual circles? It's all about collaboration. In this way, the new paradigm will emerge autonomously, collaboratively, and organically. And well, and he's sharing a website. Yeah, where apparently, yeah, they are well, proposing this website with the work that they've been doing. Yeah, I don't know if Laura, if you want to respond to that, or maybe.
Yeah, I don't really know the details of the proposal. It's really hard. I will definitely look at this, but I don't know exactly what the system looks like. I'm curious. So
okay, yeah, maybe we can keep. I think with the recording also all the messages and everything is saved, so then we can maybe recover the website address and everything. Great. I think probably, maybe we can stop here unless, you have any other comments, anything? But maybe, I think it's 4:22 here. We've been almost for 2 hours almost. So maybe it's a good time to stop. Yeah, and also because especially in Europe, it's pretty late now, I think, for you. So well, thanks again for everyone. Okay, to attend here, both Laura, Lorena, and Federico, for sharing all your thoughts. I think it's been very encouraging. It has helped me a lot in my pessimistic perception. So it has helped me a lot to rethink and see new possibilities and ways to do things. So thanks everyone, and thanks everyone also for all the attendees. And well, and then just if you are interested also in the work that we are doing at Minim, please check the website, okay, and also engage also with us, or send us your ideas, proposals for articles for the magazine, or ways to collaborate in the future. Okay, so then, well, I think we can stop here. Okay, so well, thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Take care.